Okay, so picture the scene. It's the first century. You are walking down the road to Damascus. The sun is beating down, dust is kicking up, and you are a man on a very, very specific mission. You're not just a traveler. You're a high-ranking religious leader. You're zealous, fiery, and absolutely convinced you're on the side of the angels. You're actually on your way to arrest people who disagree with you. And then,
Yeah.
bam, a blinding light. You fall to the ground. You hear a
The
voice.
classic story of Saul becoming Paul. I mean, it's one of the most famous moments in Western history.
Right, exactly. We've all heard it, in Sunday school, history class, pop culture. We call it the conversion of Paul.
Hmm.
The usual story is that he just switched teams. He upgraded his religion from version 1.0 to version 2.0, but what if we've been using the wrong word for 2,000 years?
And that is the huge question on the table for us today.
Well,
Because we're about to dive into some source material that suggests this wasn't a conversion at all. It wasn't an upgrade. It was more like a demolition.
welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really fascinating and, I gotta say, pretty challenging lecture series from the Kenosis channel. The speaker is called a companion pastor, and he argues that what happened to Paul, and frankly what Jesus was even doing, wasn't some software patch to fix a few bugs in Judaism. It was a total paradigm shift.
And we really need to pause on that phrase for a second. Paradigm shift. It gets thrown around so much, in corporate meetings.
Oh yeah, we need a paradigm shift in our synergy. Usually just means they're changing the logo.
Exactly. But the source is using it in its strict scientific sense. A paradigm shift isn't improving the rules of the game. It's flipping the table over, throwing the board away, and starting a completely different game.
Yeah.
And the argument here is that we have spent 2,000 years slowly drifting away from that original game board. We use the same words, law, faith, chosen people, but they might mean the complete opposite of what they meant back then.
So it's like a massive 2 millennia-long game of new.
Well, it's like a game of telephone, right? The message starts as one thing, it passes through Rome, medieval Europe, the Reformation. And by the time it gets to us, it's just garbled.
Precisely. And because of that drift, the source argues we're reading the text through a lens that just distorts everything.
So our mission today is pretty heavy. We're going to try to unpack this lecture, try to decode that game of telephone. We'll look at why casting out demons might actually be about casting out dogma. We'll see how the chosen people became a burden, not a privilege. And we are going to look at a guy named Martin Luther and how a thunderstorm in the 1500s might have,
Right.
accidentally confused the entire Western world about what the Bible actually
That's a
says.
huge claim. It challenges the roots of both Catholic and Protestant thinking.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable stuff if you're attached to tradition. But if you follow the logic of the source, it is incredibly clarifying. Well, let's start with the disruption then. The lecture is pretty adamant that Jesus and Paul, they weren't reformers. They weren't just trying to fix the system from the inside.
Right. He draws this great analogy, about time to explain it. He says, think about the difference between the 1900s and the 2000s. We're not just living in a slightly older version of the 19th century, right? The digital age, the internet, the way we connect, it's a completely different era.
You can't take a rule book for, I don't know, running a farm in 1890 and apply it to running a software company in 2024. The context is just gone.
Exactly. You can't just tweak the rules. You need a new board.
Yeah.
And the source argues that Jesus wasn't trying to coexist with the religious establishment of his day, the scribes and Pharisees. He wasn't saying, hey guys, let's just be a little nicer.
No, I was really struck by the specific language the source highlighted here. I think we tend to think of Jesus as, gentle Jesus, meek and mild. But the source points out he called the religious leaders vipers, a brood of snakes.
And he pronounced, woe to you.
Yeah, which sounds so old-timey to me. Woe is me. It sounds sad, like he's just disappointed.
But in that first century context, woe wasn't an expression of sadness. It was a curse. It was a condemnation, a declaration that the very root of their system was rotten. The lecturer says the system had gone wrong, that it had been corrupted somewhere along the way.
And this idea of corruption, this leads to one of the most surprising takes in the whole lecture. The dirty ghost.
The demons.
Right. We see Jesus and the disciples casting out demons all over the New Testament. And usually in a modern church, that's treated in one of two ways. Either it's totally literal, like The Exorcist, head-spinning stuff, or it's seen as a primitive way of describing, say, mental illness.
Correct. Those are the standard takes. But the source pivots hard on this. He asks, why is there so much talk about demons in the Gospels? And he suggests these dirty ghosts. They represent something more social. They represent toxic dogmas.
Wait, hold on. Is he saying there are no spirits? Or is he saying the function of the story is different? Because saying a demon is just a bad idea feels like a very modern psychological spin.
That's a fair question.
Mm.
And the source isn't really arguing about the metaphysics of it all. He's arguing about the mechanism of possession. Think about it. What happens when a toxic belief takes over a group of people? It controls them, it speaks through them, it makes them act irrationally, it harms people. In a very real sense, they are possessed by that ideology.
That actually makes a ton of sense when you look at history or even just social media today. People get possessed by a narrative, they stop thinking for themselves, they just repeat the script.
Exactly. So when Jesus sends the disciples out to cast out demons, the source argues he isn't just running a mobile health clinic. He's telling them to purge the community of these twisted ideologies, to tear down the false teachings, to get back to the original essence of humanity.
That is a huge shift in perspective. It
Yeah.
makes spiritual warfare sound a lot less like a fantasy novel and a lot more like an intellectual and social revolution.
It does. And the source argues that without understanding this, that the demon is often inside the church's own theology, you can't really get the New Testament. You're just reading miracle stories instead of seeing the ideological battle happening underneath.
Okay, so if the demons are these possessing ideologies, what was the big one? What was the head demon they were fighting?
Well, the source points a giant finger at the concept of the chosen people.
Which is, I mean, that's foundational to the Old Testament, right? The Israelites are God's chosen people. Isn't that the whole point?
Historically, yes. The Korean term the lecture uses is sunmen, the elect, the chosen. By the time of Jesus, the Jewish people saw this almost entirely as a privilege. We are special. God is ours. You are not.
The ultimate VIP pass. I'm on the list, you're not.
And the lecturer gives some honestly shocking examples of how deep this exclusion went. He digs into the oral traditions, the Talmudic teachings of that specific era to show just how high the walls were.
Yeah, I have to admit, I flinched when I read this part.
Yeah.
It's pretty dark.
It is brutal. The source mentions instructions like, if a Gentile non-Jew asked for directions, you should actually send them the wrong way.
That's just petty.
It gets worse. There was a teaching that if a Gentile woman is giving birth, a Jewish midwife shouldn't help her. And the reason? Because it would just bring another devil or idolater into the world.
Wow. That's horrifying. It's completely dehumanizing.
It is. But, and here's where the deep dive context really matters, we have to ask why. The source is clear. This wasn't just random cruelty. It was a survival mechanism.
Survival against who?
Hellenism. Greek culture. Remember, Alexander the Great had swept through centuries before, and Greek culture was just swallowing the world. It was powerful, it was seductive, and it was erasing local identities. The Jewish people were a tiny nation being crushed. To survive, they built these massive walls of exclusion.
Okay, I get that. It's like a turtle going into its shell. If you don't have that hard shell, you get eaten.
Exactly. Exclusion was their shield.
Yeah.
But here's the problem. The shield had become a prison. They were so focused on keeping the unclean out that they lost the plot. And this is where Paul comes in.
Paul, the guy who, before the road to Damascus, was arresting people for threatening that shield.
The ultimate insider. And this is the paradigm shift. Paul doesn't say you aren't chosen anymore. He keeps the title. But he rotates the meaning 180 degrees. He says, yes, you are chosen. But being chosen isn't a VIP pass. It's a job description.
From privilege to duty.
The source puts it as moving from us versus them to we are responsible for them. The logic is if the world is a mess, if the nations are lost, you don't blame the nations. You blame the chosen people for not doing their job of blessing the world.
That is a powerful reframing. It changes chosen from a status symbol into this heavy burden of service.
And that's why he was so controversial. He was taking their greatest badge of honor, their national pride, and turning it into a mandate to serve the very people they hated. He was tearing down the wall they'd built for survival.
Which brings us to the mortar that held that wall together, the law. I think most of us assume that, in the Bible, Jews had the law, Moses, the Ten Commandments, and everyone else, the Gentiles, were just lawless heathens running around.
That is the common assumption. But the source points out that Paul completely rejected that. Paul argued that everyone has the law.
Even the Greeks who were worshiping Zeus.
Yes. Paul says that for the Gentiles, the law isn't written on stone tablets, it's written on their conscience. And the source makes a really interesting distinction here. He says the law of Moses and the law of conscience are basically aiming at the same thing.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate. When people talk about the law, they usually mean the specific rules. Don't eat pork, keep the Sabbath. Gentiles didn't have that. They were eating pork chops.
You nailed it. And that is what scholars call Identity markers. Those are the things that make you look Jewish. And Paul was fighting against the idea that you needed those markers to be okay with God. But the real law, the essence of it, is what the source calls universal conscience.
So Paul is stripping away the cultural packaging to get to the moral core.
Exactly. And this is where the lecturer brings in Jesus' definitions. Jesus took the technical law and just exploded it into the realm of conscience. Like murder, for instance.
Thou shalt not kill. Seems pretty straightforward. Don't end someone's life.
As a civil law, sure. As long as I don't stab you, I'm good. But Jesus says if you call your brother a fool, the Aramaic word is raka, it means empty-headed, worthless. If you treat a weak person with contempt, you've already committed murder in your heart.
That raises the bar impossibly high. It's not just, did I commit a crime today? It's, did I ignore the humanity of the person who served my coffee?
Precisely. It's about the death of the relationship, not just the body. And the source applies this to adultery too, not just the act, but the lustful intent. But where it gets really concrete is the economic side. He spends a lot of time on tithes and first fruits.
Yeah, I usually hear about tithing when the church wants a new sound system. Give 10% or you're robbing God.
Right. But the source frames it totally differently. In an agricultural society, the tithe wasn't a religious tax for gold candlesticks. It was a social safety net.
How so?
Well, think about it. Some people have a bad harvest. Some get sick. You have widows, orphans, foreigners. The law of tithing was a redistribution system. It was about equality. The source argues that loving your neighbor wasn't just a nice sentiment. In the law, it was structural.
So keeping the law meant making sure your neighbor didn't starve while you had a full barn.
Yes, it meant solving their structural problems together. That is what living by the law actually means. It's not ritual, it's social justice.
Okay, I'm tracking with you. So we have a redefined chosen people, servants, not VIPs, and a redefined law conscience and social justice, not just rituals. But now we have to deal with the elephant in the room.
The big one.
The biggest theological fight in history, right? Faith versus works.
The Paul versus Luther showdown.
This is the part that confused me the most growing up, because the standard Protestant view is that Paul hated works, that trying to do things to earn God's favor was wrong, and all that mattered was faith alone.
Sola fide.
Right. But the source just calls this a massive, massive misunderstanding.
A misunderstanding caused by 2,000 years of drift, but specifically centering on one man, Martin Luther. And to get this, the expert says we have to step into Luther's shoes. We have to look at his trauma.
Trauma? I knew he was intense, nailing theses to doors and all that. I didn't know about trauma.
The source paints this vivid picture. Young Luther wasn't a monk, he was a law student. One day, 1505, he's caught in this violent thunderstorm. It's apocalyptic. Lightning strikes right next to him. He is absolutely terrified of dying right there.
Talk about a come to Jesus moment.
Literally. He screams out a vow to St. Anne, "Save me, and I will become a monk." He survives, and he keeps his word. He enters the monastery. But that fear, it doesn't leave him. He is haunted by guilt. He sees God as this angry judge ready to strike him down at any second.
So he tries to appease the judge.
He tries to earn his safety. He gets into extreme asceticism, fasting, sleeping in the cold. The source mentions him in Rome, climbing the Scala San Capilate stairs on his knees, kissing each step, trying to buy forgiveness.
He was trying to work his way to heaven.
Exactly. And this is the crucial point. When Luther read Paul's letters and saw the phrase, "not saved by works," Luther shouted, "Amen." Because he was thinking about climbing those stairs. He was thinking about Catholic rituals, indulgences, penance. He thought Paul was attacking that.
Paul lived 1,500 years before Martin Luther. Paul had never seen a Catholic monk climbing stairs.
No, he hadn't. And that's the disconnect. When Paul said works of the law, he wasn't talking about good deeds or moral effort. He was talking about those identity markers we mentioned, circumcision, dietary laws, the things that separated Jews from Gentiles.
Oh, I see. So Paul was saying to the Gentiles, you don't need to get circumcised to be part of God's family. He wasn't saying you don't need to be a good person.
Correct. But because of Luther's specific battle with the Catholic Church, we have projected Luther's baggage onto Paul. We read the Bible through Luther's trauma. And we think Paul is saying, don't try to be good, just believe. But the source points out that Paul actually agreed with Jesus.
The source quotes Galatians and Romans here. You reap what you sow.
God will give to each person according to what they have done. Paul says that repeatedly. The source argues that separating faith from social ethics is a sick theology. It's a theology that needs to be cast out, just like those demons.
That's a heavy distinction because I think a lot of people hear faith not works and they hear, I don't have to do anything.
Right. It becomes a get-out-of-jail-free card.
So what is faith then, if it's not just a magic password where you say, I believe and get into heaven?
The synthesis the source provides is this. Faith is the reliance on God's grace to empower you to do the good works. You can't do the heavy lifting of social justice, of loving your enemy on your own willpower. You need grace. You need faith. But the purpose of that faith is to produce the fruit of justice.
So it's not faith or works, it's faith for works.
Ideally, yes. But the source laments that modern Christianity often stops at faith and ignores the works part because they are so afraid of being called legalistic. They've confused Paul's rejection of ritual with the rejection of morality.
Which implies that a lot of people might be believing the right things, checking all the doctrinal boxes, but missing the entire point because they aren't doing the works of justice.
The source is quite blunt about it. He suggests that if you have a theology where you can be saved without having a transformed life that helps your neighbor, that's a demon that needs to be exorcised. It's a corruption of the root.
It really connects back to that idea of the paradigm shift from the start. We aren't just tweaking the definition of salvation. We're moving the whole playing field from getting to heaven to fixing the world.
And restoring that original essence. The lecturer believes that if you strip away the 16th century debates and the 20th century culture wars, you find that Jesus and Paul were on the exact same page.
Which is funny because you so often hear people say, oh, I like Jesus, but I'm not sure about Paul. Paul's the grumpy uncle. Jesus is the cool teacher.
Right. And the source says that's because we're reading Paul through Luther's glasses. If we take those glasses off, Paul becomes the faithful student who took Jesus' radical message of love and universalized it for the whole world.
So let's just recap this journey because we've covered a lot of ground. We started on the road to Damascus with the paradigm shift. It wasn't about starting a new religion, but exploding the barriers of the old one.
We saw that demons might be the toxic ideas we hold, like the idea that we're inherently better than others. And we saw that the chosen aren't the VIPs. They are the servants with the most responsibility.
We learned that the law isn't about not eating shrimp. It's about a conscience that refuses to let a neighbor starve.
And finally, we realized we can't read ancient letters as if they were written to solve medieval European problems. Works meant one thing to Paul, circumcision, and a completely different thing to Luther climbing stairs. And confusing the two has led to a faith that often feels disconnected from real life.
It really makes you realize how fragile our understanding of history is. We think we know what these words mean, but they've just been traveling through time, picking up all this baggage along the way.
That is the big takeaway for me. We cannot understand ancient texts by applying modern definitions to ancient words. A 1st century Jew, a 16th century German monk, and a 21st century person listening to this. We are all using the word law, but we might be talking about 3 completely different things.
It's a call to humility, really, and maybe a call to be a bit more curious about where our so-called absolute truths actually come from.
Absolutely. And the source leaves us with this provocative thought. He suggests that because of all these misunderstandings, many people see Jesus' teachings and Paul's teachings as being in conflict. But if we accept this paradigm shift, they become identical.
Which leaves us with a question for you to mull over today. If something as fundamental as faith versus works could be a 500-year-old misunderstanding, what else is in there? How many other absolute truths do we hold that are actually just lost in translation?
That's a question worth diving into.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. Keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.